Thank you for coming. Welcome to Uprising 1313. For those of you who've been with us last year in Nietzsche 1313, you'll recall how we got here, or rather, how we thought we'd be exploring this year, Revolution 1313. It was by no means just because of the Trump election. We had fully expected to be here rethinking revolution under a Clinton administration. No, it was thinking through the critical implications of Nietzsche's thought, of the Zarathustrian Nietzsche. We'd finished the year on the great Iranian thinker Ali Shariati and the question of Nietzsche and Foucault's influence on some of the secular but spiritual thinkers of the Iranian Revolution. Revolution 1313 was our original plan, Jesús, Velasco, and I. And we marshaled 13 of them, in fact, from the French and American revolutions, of course, to the 1917 Russian and Bolshevik revolutions, but also the sexual revolution. I have the list here, actually: the Cuban Revolution, the Silk Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, the fall of the Wall, the Velvet Revolution, the Carnation Revolution, the Arab Spring, the Iranian Revolution, the scientific revolutions. We had them all, and yet we were unable to get past the word revolution, the problematic word revolution. Why? Because of the seemingly inevitable failure of revolution that chills action? Because of the very anticipation and the fear of failure? Because of that damning thesis that revolution leads only to terror? Or as Simona Forti writes, that revolution hosts in its genetic code the mark of terror and totalitarianism? Because of the warning, that prescient warning of Etienne Balibar, that revolution only brings about a more powerful preemptive counter-revolution, a theme that we'll come back to over the course of this year, and especially in the last session on counter-revolution. Or because of the problems, as Gayatri, Chakravorty, Spivak reminds us, of thinking with Bukharin and Mao that the dictatorship of the proletariat is for the Western world and the agricultural sector is for the rest? Perhaps all of those, or perhaps not. No, perhaps I think it was because of the historians who have spoiled revolution for us in conceptualizing it, in historicizing it, in somehow raising it above all its illegitimate children: revolt, insurgency, disobedience, trouble, hacking, standing ground, breaking silence, Black Lives Matter. The historians who have raised revolution above those peripheral, those ancillary, those sometimes aborted struggles for social change. And so in the end, we decided instead to study those bastards of history, the illegitimate children of revolution, the failures, the miscarriages, the events that did not make history, that did not periodize our lives. But we could not do that first without theorizing and rethinking the modern concept of revolution. And that's where we're going to start tonight. And so for this session, we looked far and wide. As you know, this year we will be bringing speakers from Africa, from Latin America, from Europe, from the Middle East, from Asia, from North and South, from East and West. And yet, as we looked around the world, it turned out it was right here at Columbia that we could find our best interlocutors for this interrogation on revolution. I will rapidly present our guests in the order of presentations, in the alphabetical order. All three have so graciously journeyed with us over the past two 1313s, the first on Foucault's Collège de France lectures, the second on critics of Nietzsche. So we will start tonight with the inimitable Etienne Balibar, our colleague here at Columbia University, who is also teaching this semester at Columbia a seminar precisely on the modern concept of revolution. His works from reading Marx's Capital with Althusser to the philosophy of Marx, politics, and the other scene, on the dictatorship of the proletariat. These works have been and have made Balibar one of the leading thinkers on precisely this question of revolution. And we've been working with him closely and thank him extremely over the summer for organizing this seminar. Next, Simona Forti will speak, also of Columbia University this year, who also will be teaching a brilliant seminar this term on subjectivity and power under the auspices of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality and the CCCCT. Professor Forti joined us last year for the Arendt seminar on Nietzsche, and her brilliant book, New Demons, Rethinking Power and Evil Today, which has just been translated into English and published by Stanford University Press in 2015. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, our university professor here at Columbia and founding member of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, will speak next. Professor Spivak is known to most of you and just celebrated the 2016 40th anniversary edition of Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology, which I generally refer to as the original version, and the publication recently of An Aesthetic Education in the Age of Globalization. Professor Spivak also accompanied us 2 years ago on the session on the courage of truth, which was our final session for Foucault 1313, and on the Nietzsche session on Derrida, of course. So tonight we'll launch Uprising 1313 by turning back to futures past with this spectacular panel. Now, this will be quickly followed on Saturday, for those of you who won the lottery, with a guided tour of the exhibit at the Brooklyn University that focuses on the work of Black women artists, titled We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 1965-85, and that's at the Brooklyn Museum on Saturday, as well as a film series, and you have the, you've seen, and you have the flyers and the postcards for the film series, Cinéma of Resistance, curated by Nora Phillip and presented by the Columbia Maison Française and other sponsors, including CCCT, which begins in less than a month in October. There will be a year of programming, and we invite you to check the Uprising 13 website. At the top up there, there's something called Extra Seminars that will talk about extra seminars. There's the Paris seminars. If you're in Paris, we've got a whole suite of seminars going on there as well. There's going to be one slight change in the format this year. We're going to have shorter preparatory remarks in order to allow for more discussion among all of us. We will keep initial presentations down to 15 minutes in order to allow everyone to participate and talk and have a conversation to foster a real seminar dialogue. The shorter introductions on our part as well, Jesús and me, to get more directly into the intervention. We hope you've read the posts that are online when you go to 113, as well as the readings, which were Koselleck and Marx, which were also online when you go to 113. You can find the readings there. We will assume that everybody's read the posts and the readings and launch after a short presentations into the conversation. After the short presentation, Jesús Velasco, my inimitable intellectual comrade in arms and our brilliant legal historian and medievalist here at Columbia University, will moderate the conversation as only he can. And before I start and turn it over to Etienne Balibar for a short presentation, I do want all of us to thank Anna Krautheimer, who is over there, without whom we wouldn't be here right now. So thank you, Anna.
Give me a microphone. Thank you. Thank you very much. Even people standing. Okay. It's incredible. Can you hear me? No? Where do I read? Okay. And now? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Bernard. I'm truly delighted to be here. Once again, part of your beautiful project with Jesús. and of course many other colleagues and friends who are associated from the beginning to this series of presentations and discussions which now are inimitable, as you said, have become inimitable. It's an honor, it's a perilous honor to be the first speaker. Of course, it means that in a few minutes I'll be rid of my obligations for the whole year. But it also means that if I'm too bad, you might draw the conclusion that the whole thing is on a bad road. Okay. You already gave some interesting explanations regarding the reasons, the excellent reasons that pushed you to substitute what had been the initial name for the project, although I'm sure the content were already largely aiming in the same direction, and therefore replace revolution with, substitute revolution with uprising. So I'm not going to try and second guess all the latent implications of that substitution. I know that Gayatri wants also to address that because I had a look at her forthcoming paper. But still, allow me to add one quick suggestion to what you said, and that could immediately bring me to my semantic considerations. Of course, I was aware that there should be a Foucauldian influence or suggestion behind that. We'll certainly return to that, but you referred to Foucault's interventions and commentaries at the time of the so-called Iranian Revolution in 1979. This was short-lived. The question of the conclusions that Foucault drew from that participation in these conversations is still an open question, and there are relatively sharp, I would say, oppositions among the commentators. So my point will be simply that in one of the best-known articles that he published at the time, he explicitly rejected the category revolution. He said, in spite of the fact that the Iranians are using that term, I don't want to take it myself. I think it takes us in the wrong direction for a number of reasons, the wrong historical associations, the wrong strategic and subjective or political consequences. And from all this, I just want to retain one suggestion. Namely, the idea that what characterizes the soulèvement, as he said, that is the uprising, that could be also translated perhaps as insurgency in a slightly different context, is of course the fact that it is massively, and Foucault would add courageously, or at the risk of the lives and the liberties of the people, confronting a certain power, or perhaps even a sovereign power. But it is not trying to conquer that power in the sense in which in the past revolutions were meant to lead to seizing the state power and establishing in its stead some antithetic or inverted form, which in fact in the end appears to essentially follow the same logic. the dictatorship of the proletariat, of infamous memory that you mentioned a moment ago, being a case in point. So that suggests something like the idea that there is something good and essential in the idea and the examples of revolution that we can take historically, in as much as they express precisely the effort of liberation or emancipation, but in a sense, any revolutionary process that will not end in its opposite, and I will return to that, become transformed or reverted into another form of domination and subjection, ought to be somehow interrupted or suspended, that is, remain attached to the initial gesture, without which, of course, there would be no revolution, namely, of course, rising, standing up, raising one's voice, one's forces. This would be also the process through which the revolution doesn't become, in Saint-Just's famous terms, which have now become, of course, commonplace, frozen in its own process. Now, there is here also a suggestion which probably is haunting many, will be haunting many of our discussions, as to whether revolution is the most general category, and therefore all the others that we have in mind, uprising, insurgency or insurrection, rebellion, revolt, resistance, protest, and so on, simply represent specific particular moments that should be somehow integrated in the general pattern of revolutionary transformation, or in fact, the reverse. I mean, the reverse. Revolution is a limited type of uprising or insurrection, which has its specific contradictions. Now, that takes us, I've already spoken too much for my plan, takes us to of course, asking, I would say, a question of semantics, and of course the questions of semantics, the questions of semantics can never be really separated from not only their context, but also their practical intentions and consequences. They're also questions of pragmatics. And this is one of the reasons, not the least, why I, with others, suggested that, as a preliminary maybe in the first session, we draw some inspiration, I would say, from the reading of one of the most famous essays in historical semantics that that we all use and know, namely Koselleck's essay on revolution, included in the volume called Futures Past. But after this suggestion had been made, I think that the organizers had a kind of remorse. They thought, okay, Balibar is a nice guy, he's an erudite scholar, he reads German hermeneutics all the time. This is a good suggestion, but it's not very sexy, if I may put it like that, or the stakes are not strong enough. Therefore, let's add a second text. That was their suggestion, not mine. Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And in the first moment, of course, I was embarrassed because I thought what to make of these two very heterogeneous texts, until I realized that, in fact, they were absolutely inseparable. And why that? This is my point, the only one I want to make. They are inseparable because, among others, of course, but in their extraordinarily acute and intense manner, they are both organized, they are both organized, or we read them today as being both organized around the essential philosophical question, which can also be a political question, of course, of the articulation of the idea of revolution with a certain concept of historicity, and within that concept of historicity, a certain representation of time. The linearity of time, the circularity of time, the complexity or unevenness of historical times. Now, to be as short as possible on that, you said 15 to 20 minutes, so I'll remain below the 20. Let me say a few things about each of these texts. To begin with the 18th Brumaire, which is chronologically logical and not rehearsing or saying again what we all know about its text, let us nevertheless remember or take into account the fact that this is not only one of the most extraordinary literary achievements of Marx's writing, but also something quite unique in the history of philosophy and political theory, because it is a passionate and at the same time critical reflection from within on the development and the consequences of the revolutionary events themselves. We have to remember that Marx, just a few years before that, in the Communist Manifesto, for example, had announced that the revolution was coming. He was not the only one. Of course, Tocqueville and others did the same, almost exactly in the same language, but he announced that the revolution was coming, and he also announced that that revolution would be somehow the end, would mark somehow not the end of the world, although the apocalyptic tones are very clearly there, but the end of one whole epoch or era in the world history, namely the domination of the bourgeoisie and its capitalist mode of production. And then the revolution arrives, things which are not so frequent in a sense in history of philosophy, and it produces exactly the opposite effect of what Marx had announced. Not the end of the domination of the bourgeoisie, but its recreation and new stabilization in an unexpected form, which today we would probably call populist. Now, when you enter into the text, you discover then that this specific position that Marx occupies with respect to what he's analyzing led him to inventing, in fact, several remarkable schemes of interpretation of history and I would say the acceleration of historical time during the revolutionary periods, which are presented at the beginning, respectively at the beginning and at the end of the text. At the beginning are the famous phrases, they're all very famous, which say, Hegel says somewhere that history repeats itself twice. First, but he should have added, Marx say, I never found the place where Hegel said that, but I think Zizek knows it. But so he should have added first as tragedy, second as farce. This introduces the crucial notion, the crucial idea of repetition. A revolution has to be a repetition. And of course, this in a sense is negative in Marx's text. The French revolutionaries in 1789 are repeating the Roman political gestures and episodes, the Gracchi and so on and so on. And then, of course, in 1848, the French revolutionaries are repeating again what had been repeated first, but this time as farce. Therefore, Louis Napoleon is a farcical imitation of the great Napoleon, just as the Montagnards in the Second Revolution are pale and ridiculous imitations or repetitions intelligence of Robespierre and his comrades. That seems to be negative, but towards the end of the text, we get to another interpretation of the idea of repetition. Of course, what was also latent there was nobody would make a revolution if not believing that he is doing something else than what he or they are actually doing at the time. Because there's no revolution without an imaginary, and because there's no revolution without a language. The very word revolution, of course, has to come from somewhere. And at the end, you, of course, have the other famous metaphor, the old mole. This is the moment when Marx describes the concentration of state power in that populist form, and he anticipates in a quasi-messianic form the fact that the revolution itself, as an underground mole working against the visible forms of state power, will prepare for an even more radical transformation because it will have had to overcome the counter-revolutionary development itself. Now, if from there, if from there you jump to Koselleck, you find something that at the same time or on two different planes is extremely different, and something that surprisingly or curiously joins, in fact, the inspiration of something of the inspiration that I suggested we can retrieve in Marx's Etienne Brumaire. What is, of course, apparently very different, but perhaps this is only an appearance, is the fact that Koselleck is not a revolutionary himself, also not, at least not visibly, a counter-revolutionary, so he's not an actor in the story that he tells. In fact, his participation, I would say, or his investment in what he describes is perhaps better understandable if we raise the suspicion that he speaks about certain things, essentially the legacy of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century as introduction or beginning of so-called modernity, die Neuzeit. And there are the things of which he says nothing, particularly the October Revolution as such, as a new founding, or more recent event. But the text was written in 1968, although it was introduced a little later in the volume with the title Future Past, and therefore it is not, it is impossible not to ask the question of what the conjuncture here also determines. Now, I know I must finish, so I only propose the two following ideas. First, at I would say the superficial level, or the most descriptive level, Koselleck's reasoning or argument is a very positivistic one. It's a very positivistic one. It describes a periodization in the history of ideas where words are, in a sense, inevitably determined by the characters of the epoch, the era. It's very Hegelian in a sense, the Zeitgeist, in which they are used and interpreted and become active. And here, of course, you can have in mind also a phrase or a passage, a sentence from Marx's Etienne Brumaire, where Marx, continuing his description of the imaginary of the past, writes, I quote, of memory, but the coming revolution, the revolution of the 19th century, will no longer draw its poetic inspiration, remarkable formula, that is, its rhetoric, its imaginary, and its with its effectivity from the past. Let the dead bury the dead, famous quote from the Gospel. It will draw its inspiration from the future. It is almost as if Koselleck had this phrase in mind before his eyes, writing the title of his old collection, Futures Past, with a question mark, and as if he were saying, okay, Marx says the 19th century revolution, but we're no longer in the 19th century. We are in the 20th century, and that is another era, and therefore this description or this imagination of the future itself has no future. And here, my very last term, we of course may draw the conclusion that implicitly, at least, Koselleck's description is very restrictive, negative, and if it can be called counter-revolutionary, this is by implication, so to speak. But then we get to the end of the text, and at this moment, the very same, I would say, antinomian and eschatological inspiration that we found in Marx's text returns very interestingly in Koselleck's text, which might suggest that it has an intrinsic relationship to the idea and the uses of the term revolution. It returns in the following form. I summarize and I abbreviate. Perhaps the idea of revolution is no longer meaningful, but the idea of counter-revolution, in a sense, is surviving its own antithetic notion in various forms, but particularly, of course, in the form of the deadly circle of antagonism between state power and civil war. Now, from this, I draw the simple idea that what Koselleck, in his own terminology, would call the frame of expectation, Erwartungshorizont, which is the key concept, in fact, in a sense, has overcome and disturbed his own positivistic narrative. And my provisional conclusion is the following. We find ourselves today precisely in that situation on the limit where we are tempted to conclude from a number of experiences that the idea of revolution either has lost its meaning, explanatory or perhaps emancipatory power, although in a sense the word, for want perhaps of another one, a better one perhaps, but I don't see which one we could use, remains as an Erwartungshorizont, as a frame of expectation, essentially because the counter-revolution is more, and even the preventive counter-revolution is more visible and, of course, more brutally weighing on our lives or the lives of some of our neighbors and contemporaries than it ever was. So, to return to the starting point, we see uprisings, we see rebellions, we find them sometimes weak, sometimes strong, meaningful, important. The more the forms of contemporary capitalism that I'm tempted to call absolute capitalism become pervasive and repressive, the more we are tempted to consider these resistances and uprisings as important symptoms of the times and phenomena. But the question of their transformation into a revolutionary process that Foucault had thought he could sidestep is, in a sense, permanently haunting that observation. And, of course, this is why, in a sense, we make a seminar like this one.
So, thank you everybody. I'm a bit intimidated of being here in this hall. Yes, I'm sorry for the back. Okay, I will try to speak. And instead of asking myself, reformulating the famous title of a chapter on revolution of Arendt, which are the lost treasures of the modern revolutionary tradition, I will start from the question, which are, if there are, the hidden treasures of the criticisms to the modern concept of revolution, which are the conservative and anti-revolutionary refrains, how to distinguish them from the critical perspectives of a radical politics that sometimes shares their argument, but moves instead from different, altogether different premises and toward altogether different objectives. These are the questions, immense, I know, that orient rather schematically and cursorily my brief intervention, which will not focus on the analysis of Marx's test. It would be absurd, given the competence on Marx of the other participants at the table, but start from some questions emerging from the test by Koselleck, an author. Maybe I was wrong in assuming this, but I thought not widely known among students in US. In the pages that we posted in the blog, I provided some details about the school of conceptual history to which Koselleck belonged. But just summarize something, that for the conceptual history assumption, the 100 years separating mid-18th century and mid-19th century represent for the authors, and for Koselleck in particular, the so-called Sattelzeit. Saddle time, threshold time, watershed time, I don't know the exact translation, the threshold that ushers in modernity. Obviously, the thesis is trenchant and rather controversial and has raised many polemics. But according to Koselleck, freedom, democracy, history, revolution, the terms that have accompanied the 1,000-year-old social and political experience of the West, in modernity changed dramatically their meaning. This concept, according to Koselleck, did not limit themselves to register historical changes. They generated social and political changes. So, far from being merely a work of historical, genealogical reconstructions, I think that Koselleck's work makes the author, Koselleck, more a philosopher of history, than a historian. For the thesis underlying the radical break between the modern and the pre-modern world is more a philosophical claim than an historical analysis. And it's not by chance that Koselleck speaks of the essence of modernity, the essence of the concept of revolution. And revolution, in fact, reveals, better than the other concepts, the historical essence of modernity that overturns the internal structure of the categories that have to do with the human praxis. This is because the essence of modernity is inaugurated by a conception of time that redesigns both the meaning of experience and the horizon of expectations of the human animals. So, in modernity, a perspective centered toward the future bursts through, which raises to the ground the meaning of history as a repository of examples and emblematic experiences. In a word, it shatters the idea of history as magistra vitae. Beginning with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, Koselleck tells us, the term revolution completely redesigns its context. For almost 2,000 years, revolution referred to anakyklosis, the cyclical theory of political forms, according to which just a limited number of political forms come in succession. Revolution, Koselleck continues, now surges, beginning with the period of the French Revolution, to a trans-historical and meta-historical category. That means that confers meaning and value to the events only according to the exclusive meter of the final realization. So detached from reference to nature and the order of the cosmos, the idea of revolution becomes, for Koselleck, a collective singular, an abstract and universal category within which the plurality of human events are subsumed and annihilated under this generalization. And this impulse becomes overwhelming when not only the focus is on political revolution, but it shifts to social revolution. So what I want to bring to your attention is the kind of criticism that Koselleck moves to the modern revolutionary spirit. I think that hidden below the neutral and poised tone of a study that pretends to be a simple study in the history of concepts, we can glimpse a modality of criticism that we can ascribe to a very specific strand in the critique of modernity. It is the conviction, never expressed fully, explicitly by Koselleck, that inherent to modern revolutions and their aspiration to social equality is not only a totalizing tendency, but also a totalitarian one. It's precisely, for Koselleck, the progressive character of the project aimed at the emancipation of social relationship from any kind of domination, which imprints onto the idea of change the pernicious mark of permanent revolution. The revolution becomes a constant state of exception, which in order to keep moving constantly needs to individuate and eliminate its enemies, especially internal enemies. So from Robespierre to Lenin, and this is the assumption of conceptual history, everything is explained and legitimated in the name of the revolutionary process and its ultimate goal, from wars to summary executions, from the guillotine to concentration camps. So behind Koselleck's essay, we glimpse the profiles of those authors who, in part, sharing the Heideggerian reading of Western metaphysics, link modernity to the process of secularization and put its revolutionary zeal on trial. It's a number of intellectuals differing deeply from one another, and sometimes they even disagree with each other about the real start of modernity. Let us think of Carl Schmitt and his polemics with Leo Strauss. But among the most intelligent and sophisticated of them, we must pause just for a moment on Karl Löwit, who was one of Koselleck's teachers, because he really seems to be speaking through Koselleck's pages. Let's recall the pivotal idea put forward in Meaning in History, one of the most important works by Löwit. The thesis goes, if the ancient world remained tethered to the idea of limit, to the idea of a cosmos naturalistically bounded as the horizon of meaning of the mortal's pragmata, the modern vision of history is instead characterized by that process of universalization and abstraction that overwhelms any distinction and sense of boundary. If inherent to the classical concept of historian was the meaning of each event in itself, modernity's futurocentric and future-oriented revolution empties the single events of their own meaning, transferring it to the final sense withheld from the experience of the single individuals. Though, in a philosophical refined way, Löwit, so to say, leads his student Koselleck to join the proponents of the so-called theorem of secularization, according to which modern philosophy of history, expressed by Hegel and Marx, and politically by the experience of the French and Bolshevik Revolution, would be the result of the secularization of the Judeo-Christian eschatology, which considers the human event only in the light of the final salvation. This is certainly not the place to dwell on the details of and the differences among these interpretations of the modern concept of revolution as secularization of the Christian eschaton. The conclusions reached by this reading, with which Koselleck, I think, agrees, even if in a more quiet and masked way, can be brutally summarized in the idea according to which modern revolution, with its linear and progressive temporality, is deep down inhabited by a nihilistic drive. Whether this is because it is gnostic, idolatric with respect to real transcendence, as some author, as Eric Vogelin and Gurian would have it, whether it is because it is run through by the hubris of the absence of limit and the wish for the infinite and the absolute, as Löwit assumes, revolution for these interpreters hosts in its genetic code the mark of terror and totalitarianism. Now, this criticism, so to speak, theological, of the idea of revolution, accusing it of being a masked eschatology, is so radical and all-embracing that leaves no margin to falsification or negotiations. Take it or leave it. It does not help us much in understanding what is to be saved from revolutionary experiences, what is good in them to keep with us today, though we might inflect it and name it differently. Moreover, the influence of these criticisms, intelligent and symptomatic of a certain historical period, as they were, seems to have fizzled together with the revolutionary impetus. And some scholars emphasize the influence of Hannah Arendt behind Koselleck's thesis on revolution, as if she aligned perfectly with the proponents of the theorem of secularization. Her reading of the development of French Revolution as an event that sacrifices freedom to necessity, her apparent aversion for the social question as a political problem, her idiosyncratic reading of Marx partly justify the hypothesis of an affinity with that company and Koselleck. Undoubtedly, Arendt indicates the revolutionary logic that pretends to obey and enact the laws of history. And she denounces many times the dangerous transformation of the revolutionary subject into an amorphous mass that moves as one single body with one single will. All these traits are for her dangerously tied to the dynamics of totalitarian movement. Nonetheless, for Hannah Arendt, as you know, there is not just one model of revolution, just one revolutionary tradition. Throughout modernity, there have been revolutions whose successes and failures have traced diverse paths for us. However arbitrary it may be from the historical point of view, her own revolution tells us something very different about modernity and its revolutionary heritage. Townships where American revolutionaries could meet and participate, the Soviets in 1905 and 1917 in Russia, Die Räte in post-war I Germany, the revolutionary councils in 1956 Hungary. All these public spaces and political bodies are the evidence for her that modern revolutions harbored many events of freedom. The breaks in history through which the experience of freedom could manifest itself in the highest form. Freedom qua beginnings, in fact, has been experienced by actors who, in concert with one's peer, have succeeded in founding a new political space, a space of horizontal participation against any social, historical, and natural determinism. So, far from being simply one of the many followers of the thesis of secularization and the inspirator of Koselleck, Hannah Arendt, I believe, has actually been the inaugurator, not always recognized, much used, and awfully badly cited, of a minoritarian tradition with many ramifications. A minoritarian tradition, at least in the second part of the 20th century, which we might define libertarian but not liberal. A minoritarian tradition that drew energy from the criticism to the classical Marxist model of revolution to launch a different way to think political and social change. And a minoritarian and plural tradition that helps us to think revolution differently, and probably through different names, but without renouncing the potential for change that idea brought forth. Certainly, the Arendtian idea of power that remains one with freedom only as long as it remains plural and auroral, the attempt that is to tie together the force of beginnings, constituent power, with the permanence of a public space composed by webs of participation that are dispersed and dislocated, all this is not without contradiction and aporias. Aporias, yes. And yet, it's maybe precisely this aporetic character, of which Arendt was well aware, that inspired some of the most interesting perspectives of a so-called radical politics. Though undertaking paths that are very different from one another, and none without stumbling stones, from Foucault to Butler, these perspectives all share the Arendtian intuition of freedom as anarchy, not in the political traditional meaning, but as an ontology of anarche, as Rainer Schurman would put it. Before being a political project, this intuition is a specific vision of being, an ontology, singular and plural at the same time. Remaining faithful to such ontology without letting it paralyze us in action is the great challenge of today. Rephrasing Derrida, we could say, almost impossible, yet necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you can. This mic is now picking me up, no? Okay, very good. And now I actually want to cite Lenin's definition of a revolutionary situation as a situation in which the ruled classes have to want in a communist way. Without collective communist desire, revolutionary upheaval moves in a counter-revolutionary direction. I want to focus on that wanting, desire, rearrangement of desire. And I'm not going to stay there now because we are supposed to speak 20 minutes at most. I want to begin with the Rohingyas being plowed down mercilessly in Burma. We are, of course, asking in the short range for a safe zone protected by UN peacekeeping forces. But the real requirement is a revolution in consciousness, wanting in a certain way, required by UN peacekeepers whose alleged record for rape is scary, and of course by all ethnic cleansers, extreme identitarians around the world. And given the upsurge of right-wing sentiment among the student body in our own university, I think we need to recognize that the university also requires a revolution in consciousness, even as it undertakes to save the world. We have forgotten that a university is a mind-changing machine, wanting in a certain way. That's what we will to social justice. Mind-changing machine rather than merely an instrument of upward class mobility leading to entrepreneurial success. Okay, so I'm not going to go on in terms of what I wrote, but I will say that when I was talking, I was very glad that Bernard quoted that other business about the agricultural sector, but I actually began with M.N. Roy, not Bukharin. M.N. Roy, who founded the Communist Party of Mexico, that's a pseudonym, his name was not M.N. Roy, but, and also whom Lenin liked, but Stalin disliked very much. It's that, what, 25th of the Comintern meeting where they actually, Bukharin and M.N. Roy together actually came up with that idea. I didn't quote it right. But so what I say in my long blog, which you haven't read because I really finished it just before we got here, What I say there is that I'm not quite capable of thinking that one through, what Shanin calls the late Marx and the Russian Road, where, you know, the Zasulich stuff, you know, it's, in fact, we were supposed to, optional reading was Rosa Luxemburg, and when Rosa Luxemburg writes Lenin in 1918 from jail, she is, in fact, talking about that other characteristic of Russia. So to an extent, when we think revolution, we have to think about the fact that it's not just the sort of closed and somewhat, how should I put it, breath-consuming room of Western Marxism, but also these all kinds of things all around the world where we have to think about how that particular mode of production narrative had to be changed even by Marx himself, how much he questioned its effectiveness. And Balibar knows this very well indeed, and I have learnt from him how to think it, and so on. Well, I will also say that I was initially asked to speak on Gandhi. I am not an Indianist, only an Indian. Of course, as such, I have an opinion of Gandhi, but for the occasion, the better analysis would have come from a historian or political theorist of modern India, whatever color. Why am I mentioning this? Because of identity politics. You know, it was a thing that it's identity politics that asked an Indian to speak on Gandhi, especially since in the matter of the Indian Constitution, I much prefer Ambedkar over Gandhi. And in that sense, and also Gandhi's lugubrious gender politics is not something that I can speak of. And what was very interesting about Ambedkar was that early Ambedkar, in fact, defined the caste system itself as the way of dealing, the difference between the way of dealing with surplus women over surplus men, rather than just an identity politics of how he had suffered. And in India itself, what he was interested in producing was not a Ramarajya, but a constitutional subject. So that to an extent, when we think about revolution in that context, we do not think about Gandhi. And the idea of the general strike, I mean, I'm not going to go into Gandhi, but anyway, so I just wanted to mention it. And then I wanted to say, now this identity politics, of course, it is a double bind. As I have pointed out in my recent response to Daniel Dennett, I need to say this because I said to get out of the room of Western Marxism, which is in fact not very sexy. Etienne is quite correct. I like sexy Marxism, and it is not contained in that room. But at any rate, Daniel Dennett, so I need to talk about this identitarianism just a little bit. In my recent response to Daniel Dennett for Philosophie magazine, I quote, "He's unable to appreciate the fact that he speaks from the privileged class, the privileged gender, and the privileged race, so he imagines that his concerns are those of the world. His own position in the world dictates what he perceives as truth. Yet, in spite of this, I do not think identitarianism should be entertained at a university because it stops our learning to make our imaginations flexible so that we can think about people who do not resemble us at all." And when we come to the Etienne Brumaire passage where Marx talks about the poetry of the future, we will see that there is a certain pertinence to reminding ourselves that the democratic impulse is not just about my rights, ipseity, but also the equality with people who do not resemble me at all, alterity. So, and this we can see in what Marx says about the revolution of the 19th century. And I will say this to Etienne. You know, he is not talking about poetic inspiration, my friend. He is talking about poetry. And he says that the 19th century revolution will not create its poetry, not draw its poetic inspiration, very bourgeois, but create its poetry, schöpfen, create its poetry from the future, not the past, which is rather different from a description of the French Revolution, the bourgeois revolution, which you remember in the Etienne Brumaire is beautifully dissected as leading only to an exacerbation of executive power. Now, if that is not appropriate to our time, I'm going to come back to what I was talking about, but if that is not appropriate to our time, the immense, and in fact, I have often said with other friends, that if one could do an Etienne Brumaire of the Bolshevik Revolution, then one might perhaps say that it made, and in fact Marx would agree in many ways, although he didn't live to see the Bolshevik Revolution, that well, he would have been 99 years old. But, huh?
Nobody's perfect.
Nobody's perfect, I know. Especially myself. You didn't hear him say that, okay? I'm quoting him. Nobody is perfect. But at any rate, remembering that, we should say that the Bolshevik Revolution itself made it possible for global capital to inhabit the world. So to an extent, the bourgeois revolution, which Marx diagnoses as increasing executive power, is something that comes out in the Etienne Brumaire. But at any rate, yet we must not let supremacists transform us into identitarians. And I want to remember also Gauri Lankesh, who was assassinated on September 5 because she was a communist in India, invoked universality as the goal of people marked by caste oppression. This way of understanding claiming the subject of Marxism through the affirmative sabotage of universalism, not simply proposing phantasmatic counter-universals with the Global South as center, may be a way out of claims to identity in intellectual work. One could go to Du Bois here, but I just want to say that when I was, in fact, when I wanted not to speak on Gandhi, I had proposed Du Bois. And I must say that Bernard and Jesús were absolutely chagrined that room could not be found for him. But I will also say that room must be found for a person like Du Bois, and I'm now going to cite Nahum Chandler's wonderful, wonderful work called X, The Problem of the Negro as a Problem for Thought, where he actually writes that thinking Du Bois is not just to think of the problem of the Negro, but also to think of the problem of general onto-epistemology. So therefore, someone as curious as, read the book, it's a complex argument, I can't present it here, but it really is a way of thinking that man, which I think should, especially since he tried to rewrite the revolutionary subject by looking at the so-called fugitive slaves joining the Union Army before emancipation and redefining it as general strike. I think, in fact, one needs to think also of that narrative. But at any rate, the Gandhi Ambedkar collection would lead me to a statement which I will just make as a statement and not expand on, that national liberation is not a revolution. I repeat, national liberation is not a revolution. I won't say anything about that. It's just, I'm just summarizing what is in my blog that you haven't read. But at any rate, so then I go on to talk a little bit about the fact that in the 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels talking about, this is the last edition that came out, talking about the manifesto as a historical relic. These are their words. They also say that the first part of the manifesto, because of the way in which in the last 25 years, big business has advanced, the first parts of the manifesto that are about revolutions have become veraltet, or out of date. And we really need to keep these words of the two authors, written in 1872, in mind, because their analysis of 1871 also relates to why national liberation is not a revolution, when they are talking about the fact that in, you can't just take a state machine that was already in existence and somehow make it work against its old spirit. And this is a very good lesson for most of us post-colonials. Well, anyway, I have 7 more minutes, so I will just talk about Etienne Brumaire a little bit, okay? It seems to me that in the Etienne Brumaire, Marx writes about the proletarian revolution as something that cannot happen. You remember, because now I don't mind that, because I believe, I mean, if you look at the end of the Capital Volume 1, you will see that Marx, writing, I believe, a phenomenology of capital, in fact says, I quote, that there is no such thing as capital, there is no such thing as labor, and so on and so forth. The fact that you can't give an ontophenomenological definition of revolution does not make it useless for people who read Marx in that way. But so when he's talking about the revolution, Marx talks about the proletarian revolution as, and his model is that story from Aesop, remember? Where he's saying, of course, that the revolution will repeat itself many times and so on and so forth, correct itself and so on, until finally the situation pushes it. He's not talking about human individuals or even collectivities. The situation pushes it and says, hic rodus, hic salta. Here is the rose, it tanze here. Why does, and Marx is actually taking it from Hegel, Philosophy of Right, well-known passage, where Hegel is actually talking about Rosicrucianism. In other words, mystical action. It's a very funny passage. I mean, it's not intentionally funny, but, you know, it is funny. But at any rate, so what does, I can't really, 5 more minutes. What Marx is doing is revising that hic rodus hic saltus to hic rodus hic salta, hic rodus hic salta, turning it into an imperative, and then here is die Rose, tanze here, dance here. This is also Hegel is also talking about rose and dance and so on. But I would like to suggest that when Marx talks about dance, poetry, he's talking about the content of the revolution, right? And we also know that Marx's idea of value, the labor theory of value, was form, inhaltlos, contentless. That's how he defines it. Inhaltlos und einfach, but always translated in English as slight in content for some reason, so that the reader of the English text of Marx cannot understand what Marx is talking about. Inhaltlos, contentless. On the other hand, just as unconditional ethics must go to conditions in order to become politics, or democratic freedoms must be bound to certain situations in order to be exercised. In the same way, the actual revolution is not a formal definition. It is, in fact, talking about content. And in my essay called The Global Marx, I have a page where I try to relate this choice of content over form to a passage in Hegel, not just a passage, but a whole set of thinkings in Hegel, in the Schöne Seele, over content and form, and how Marx actually, in my understanding, Marx, for whom phenomenological definition had become part of mental furniture, he was choosing the double bind of the antinomy of ideology, which is we can, we cannot. For the social revolution of the 19th century is content over the formal reconciliation of the antinomy in the mere phrase of the revolutions of the past. We can do good. So this argument is, of course, much bigger, and that's the way I go here, that by talking about poetry, dance, creating poetry, drama all through the place, bringing in Hamlet and so on and so forth, Marx actually makes room for content-wise, not formally, content-wise, the important impossibility of giving only a formal definition of the revolution. And I will also say that it is in this essay that I first read The Subaltern before Gramsci in the description of the small peasant proprietors who could not represent themselves. And in the Marxian passage, he talks about they could not make their struggles geltend zu machen. Now that is really very much an idea of subalternity, not being able to produce, not being able to produce insurrections which would be recognized, which could be recognized as such, and so on. Well, I have 2 more minutes, and I will say that I said in this piece that I wrote that my own very humble involvement with so-called producing the subaltern intellectual over the last 30 years has stumped me in terms of how to really describe the revolution, because I cannot, in fact, move out of class continuity when I think about revolutionary discourse in other parts of the world, number one. And number two, I have also said that as far as I can understand, gender revolution must remain within the juridical legal, equal rights, all kinds of, the recognition of LGBTQ trans, the kind of consciousness changing that has to happen as a result of this. I cannot any longer, because of my very deep relationship with gendered subalternity, talk carefully about the other kind of broader gender revolutions that we used to think about before. I put in there also something about how Sophocles rewrites the law of the father in a post-human way. This is completely incomprehensible if you don't read the passage, but in the blog. But I believe in the blog passage, it's really clearly marked out. And so I go on finally also just to show a picture, which I think I'll take a minute to show you if it comes up. Yes, yes, it's a picture of "Keep your laws off my pussy." This is a picture of the march on Washington, Women's March on Washington, and I say, what does intersectionality mean? Does it really? I mean, some of you might have heard a thing I did with David Eisenhower on that day on Trump and women. And in that place, there was also a wonderful Nigerian comrade who said to me that during the march, in fact, people were very aware of intersectionality from time to time. They were all sincere, but from time to time they would remember, oh dear, we've got to be intersectional. And so they became intersectional. Now, this intersectionality is kind of a romantic US notion, which relates to this class continuity and the extraordinary difficulty of actually confronting the fact that the production of the subaltern intellectual is an absolute necessity, because the disguised and concealed subalternization required by the progress of global capital today. What will a revolution be in this context? And that's where the creating the poetry of the future, dance, because for us, literary critics, those words are not just funny, sexy words. They actually are important words. We've lived our lives trying to find out how teaching that may be a kind of revolutionary teaching. So I would like to say that those are the places where we hold on. Whether Marx wanted us to or not is not the point, though there may be moments of transgression. We hold on to that when we want to escape simply formal definitions of revolution that will take us nowhere today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Etienne, Simona, and Gayatri for these interventions. I am just going to open the discussion immediately to the public, but I also wanted to maybe ask a question or make a comment or something like that, because of how we or how you brought in the question of the poetry of the future and also quoted in a couple of occasions this famous paragraph from the 18th Brumaire. And I was thinking in particular of a short moment in Koselleck's text in which he talks about, he's giving these 8 characteristics of revolution as a meta-historical concept, etc. And at a certain point, he just mentions fleetingly the idea that revolutions are always part of an economy of prophecy. And that seems to me an extraordinary, interesting idea that is not unlinked from the idea of the poetry of the future because of the prophetic element of this poetry, but also because of the close contact of poetry and prophecy. And I was wondering, I was wondering whether there are just revolutions, ideas of revolutions, notions of revolution that could escape in a certain way that kind of prophecy, that could escape in a certain way this historical time to which revolution seems to be linked in Koselleck's idea and in a certain way in Marx's text as well. So at the beginning, Bernard was talking about our choice in talking about uprising, that as Gayatri says in one of her texts, is always tamer than upheaval. But we were also wondering is whether we can actually imagine revolutions that somehow escape prophecy, that are not in sync with historical time, but that rather in sync with what Koselleck calls and opposes as is natural time. So is there this possibility of escaping prophecy and yet building this poetry of the future, not drawing its poetry from the past? We are here surrounded by these sculptures that seem to be just part of this chapter 1 of the 18th of Brumaire. And as I said, I just leave this question here, but I would like to open the conversation and just give you the possibility of asking questions, in particular encouraging our students. And remember that this is also a graduate seminar, and we are lucky enough to have an extraordinary group of graduate students with us here today and throughout the year. So please go ahead and tell us what you think and ask your questions. Catherine, you have the mic there.
I have a question for Etienne. Thank you, everyone, for your talk. I would like to ask you about the relationship between crisis and farce.
Are you me?
Yes.
Crisis and?
Farce.
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 Because in your paper you refer to the term crisis, present in Rousseau's Émile, as what you have elsewhere called the gate to how we frame the possibility for the revolution, right? That we still think of revolution as a response to a crisis. But in current times, when crisis has become the semantics of capitalism, through which governments, world banks, and other organisms justify austericide, for instance, many of the movements uprising today have focused their efforts in unmasking this to show that we are not in the face of crisis, but in the face of farce. Then taking Marx's quotation of Hegel that you cited, the revolution takes place twice, first as a tragedy and then as a farce. Could we say that capitalist appropriation of crisis as a counter-revolutionary tool to suppress the possibility of articulating future by collapsing and homogenizing tragedy and farce, insofar as austericide is suffered as a tragedy by the people and as a farce at the same time? Is this suppression the form in which capitalism retains us in this idea of presentism? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
we take several questions?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. And we have other questions. If you want, we can take them and then start a longer commentary. Charles?
Thank you. Sorry. Here it is. No, thank you. Yeah, I'm a little too quiet. So I should reveal my biases. I'm a classicist, and so sometimes I get lost when it comes to the theory, and I get bogged down by really minute details. And today I'm stuck on 5 letters. The re in revolvere, and the ana in anakoukloses, which Koselleck uses to introduce his concepts of history. And it's the different valences of these prefixes that are kind of perplexing me. Re being this repetitive one, and ana having something to do with verticality, but also with this kind of return. So in a very broad sense, I'm sort of wondering how we can talk about revolution or uprising, to use modern equivalents of both of those prefixes, without going back to Greece and Rome, especially when we're trying to write revolution with the poetry of the future, or rather, when we're trying to arrive at the poetry of the future.
Thank you. Adam?
I didn't understand what you were asking.
So I'll continue in the philological vein. I wanted to come back to the point that my colleague Spivak made about the word schöpfen, which obviously has at least 2 meanings in German, one of which is in fact to draw. In other words, to draw water would be to Wasser schöpfen. And on the other hand, also to create. So rather than posing this as the stark contrast that you did, perhaps we can think of this as a deep and rather interesting ambiguity built into Marx's sentence, right? And it's a paradox, because it's not at all easy to see how you can draw from the future. It's almost trite to see how we can draw from the past, but drawing from the future really isn't obvious. I also wanted to make a brief point about the alignment between something that Etienne said and Simona's, I think, very acute reading of Koselleck's position. Etienne described Koselleck as the observer, as opposed to, as of Marx, the participant.
At first sight.
And well, yes, but I would identify him as somebody who's paralyzed rather more, in the sense that he, I think, inhabits the mental world that Simona's describing, which describes a global civil war, which leaves to Germany, divided Germany, no historical agency. That is part of the tragedy of that generation of German conservatives, is that they go from imagining themselves in a rather perverse ways as a new Greece, in Heidegger's conception, to being the kind of paralyzed body on which the Cold War is fought, in most explicitly in somebody like Nolte. But I think the early Koselleck of the 50s is not actually very far from that position. So that notion of observerness is a little bit like Marx's position of exile with regard to the failed German Revolution of 1848. With regard to Etienne, I just really wanted to ask you, Etienne, how your reading of the counter-revolution with which you conclude your blog post, how it fits with your widely read diagnosis of the situation of Europe in terms of Gramsci's concept of interregnum. In that open democracy piece that you did, you mobilized that Gramscian term, which seemed to imply a greater degree of fragility than the rather closed vision with which your blog posts end. So 3 separate contributions, but in a sense linked by the theme of Germany, one might say, to make it pointed.
Thank you. Can you hear? Yes? Yeah, I'd like to get back to the choice of revolution versus insurrection or rebellion or uprising, depending on how you define the term or which term you want. I think it was Balibar who said that the distinction is that the revolutionary wants to take power, whereas the insurrectionist or rebel, un soulèvement, tout ça, it doesn't. It's just a rebellion. But that fits in to the logic that I think Simona Forti described very well of logic of the revolutionary model from France to Russia and China, etc., one strand within it, which entails precisely let's put it this way, a logic of taking power and then exercising it by a unitary group in the name of the whole. In this case, it's the people, it's the proletariat or the people, it doesn't matter which. And it's exclusionary for an enemy, all of this. And then, unsurprisingly, strengthens executive power and kills it itself, the members of the revolutionary groups, et cetera, et cetera. But there's another logic. There are many logics, but there's another one, at least, that Simona mentioned. Arendt talked about it, many others have since, which is the logic of creativity. There's a break, there's a change, there's a moment in time where we actually can create something. Revolution, as distinct from insurrection in this sense, creates spaces for freedom. Insurrection doesn't. She distinguishes between liberation, which is the place where insurrection, rebellion, uprising would be, and then says that's tearing something down. How about creating something? So she's concerned with political freedom. Marxism never spent too much time on that. Marxism was concerned with social revolution. Hannah Arendt should have been more concerned with social justice. I fully agree with that. I would insist on that. But and the creativity that occurs in Russia in revolutions is astounding. I'm just publishing in Constellations a series of essays on the Russian Revolution. It is the 100th anniversary after all. It is 2017, and not much is being done about it, weirdly enough. But in any case, the unbelievable flowering of creativity in the arts, in dance, in music, in literature, everything, not just politically, that happens in those moments, and then it's crushed. But at least I think that we need to, first of all, make that distinction, and then still come back to the problem, which we will not avoid, of why it is that revolutions, at least the most popular model, does end up in destroying rather than creating freedom, always in the name of, well, you just have to wait, we'll get some social justice, but it never happens. And at the same time, embracing a form of radical transformation that refuses the move of the absolute, of unitary homogenization, etc., and goes more along Arendtian lines. You might have to give up on the word revolution altogether, but that's another discussion.
You want to add something?
Just maybe three quick questions, and then we'll let the speakers address these and choose from these rich questions. So Etienne, to start with, I was thinking about the way in which you've argued, or at least in the piece, how the failure of revolution as a possible future or how revolution produces, more than anything, preemptive counter-revolution, okay? But as I was listening to you, I was interested to hear in how you were suggesting that uprisings are actually the things that are producing the preemptive counter-revolution. Right? And so it's almost, so there is this kind of crystalline structure to the argument that it's the revolutions that create preemptive culture, or then it's uprisings, but it does leave us with the question of what is it actually that produces the reaction that dominates? Is it actually the threat or the imagination of revolution, or is it instead these other forms of upheaval, uprising, etc., revolt? Simona, I was particularly taken by this turn to Arendt to understand and to deconstruct the modern singular collective notion of revolution. And so I thought that was a very powerful way to then actually think about the other forms of rebellion that we're going to be talking about, as if they could be actually the plural of the term, right? It could be that the S that you want to add to revolution, to the modern conception of revolution, can be expressed through all of these other terms that we're going to be going through. And then for Gayatri, I suppose at the end of the day, I'm not sure where notions of identitarianism fit with the questions of revolution and uprising that we're addressing today. Because so we've circled or we've revolved around questions of whether identitarian politics is ultimately productive or reactionary or not, with useful work in the 1980s trying to push us after identity, right? And so I suppose I'm, at the end of the day, I'd like some clarification, perhaps, and in part because I read the articles that you sent us, and there's this passage, right, in Global Marx, which is a recent piece, very recent, where you write, importantly, I write as a woman with no institutional training in philosophy, with 30 years of work in a backward district of West Bengal, right? And so I wanted to kind of situate that sentence in the larger conversation about revolution.
Shall we take a first round of comments from our guests? And then we already have a couple of questions, 3 questions actually.
Shall we speak in the same order, reverse order? Same order.
Same.
Okay, so.
Alphabetical order.
Yes, well, alphabetical order is a very confused notion. I mean, I thought about that all my life. I'm not, of course, my name is not Abraham or any other name beginning with an A, so I usually speak second, but sometimes. But, you know, I think you should introduce a simple rule, which is you follow the alphabetic order, but first you sort the letter with which you will begin. So it could be S, for example, or F. Anyway, okay, these are wonderful questions, very difficult, of course. They are touching the very heart of what I am trying to formulate, but I don't have a simple answer to that. Catherine, if you allow me, before I come to your point, I return, but I believe there are affinities between the two statements to something that Gayatri had said in her own presentation when she, if I well understood, proposed a small, or in fact not so small, correction or rectification to my reading of the passage in the inevitable passage in Marx's 18th Brumaire, where it is a question of the poetry of the past and the poetry of the future. So, Gayatri, correct me if I'm misquoting you, but you said, Etienne, you are too quick. You seem to believe that Marx is discussing politics and strategy or organization or relationships of forces, whereas he's actually talking about what he exactly mentions, that is poetry. Yes, and different kinds of poetry. Of course, he takes the term, I'd have to return to the German text, I'm sorry, I didn't do that. But what is it? It might be Dichtung, I'm not sure of that.
Poesie.
Huh?
Poesie.
Poesie. Okay, so it is not Dichtung. But allow me to suggest that poesy is not, well, poesy has an antithesis, which is prosa and prosaic discourse. And I'll come to that in a minute because, of course, Marx in the text, of course, interestingly, you might think this is a sort of performative contradiction, has a lot to say about the completely prosaic character of the bourgeois society, the bourgeois class, etc., except, of course, he's proposing a description that is largely borrowed from the greatest realistic novelists of the 19th century, particularly Balzac. So, in fact, there is poetry even within his description of the prosaic character. But what I want to say is poetry is an open category. So tragedy and farce are two examples or two types, I would say, but there might be others. And so while I take Gayatri's point very seriously, I would try to defend what I was trying to say, or make it a little more complicated by suggesting that, in fact, Marx does not entirely, or perhaps even not at all, separate the issue of politics from the issue of poetry and writing, if you like, and imagination, because his very object in this text, and that is something which is not unique, absolutely unique in his work, but which nevertheless reaches here a kind of extreme and remarkable precision and acuteness. His question is precisely about the combination, the mixture of both, you know. And so the latent idea is if we observe revolutions in the past and we try and anticipate the coming revolutions of the future, or the revolutions which are underway. The old mole is there digging its tunnel. We must also, we cannot avoid the question of the kind of literature which not only they produce, but without which they would not exist. And that seems to lead to the idea, which other, of course, post-Marxist writers in different ways, Benjamin, Ernst Bloch, Althusser himself, and others have tried to elaborate upon, namely the fact that in a sense, a revolutionary action is never exactly its own contemporary. Is never exactly its own contemporary. And that's also Koselleck's object in a sense. Now, of course, in Marx's text, this seems to be a negative characteristic, and this is one of the problems. There's a kind of utopian dream in the text, which has to do with imagining, so in fact he's in a circle, the moment when revolutionaries could, so to speak, as others would say, pierce the fantasy and touch the real. And at that point, they would no longer need either comedy or a tragedy or epic or prophecy or whatever discourse. So here we read Marx struggling with him and, in a sense, against the grain. Okay, so let me finish because that's too long. Now, comedy and tragedy and farce are very interesting categories. Of course, there's a Hegelian background, there are all sorts of things behind that. But essentially, what seems to be the case is revolutions have a certain intrinsic affinity with the tragic. In many ways. I mean, not only because they stage radical confrontations between laws, as Hegel would say, quoting Sophocles, which are antithetic and therefore must clash. in a form that leaves no room for jokes and mitigations. But also, of course, because the experience of revolutions, one way or another, ends in confronting the issue of the failure, the reversal, etc. And that gives inevitably a tragic dimension or flavor to the very analysis of the revolution itself. One of the passages in Marx's text, which I find most striking in this respect, because it's you have to hear the tone, is when Marx at the end says the question we should ask ourselves, or we have to ask ourselves, is why did the French proletariat not raise against the Bonapartist coup? This is, in a sense, the most tragic element. That seems to include that comedy is not a revolutionary genre. But then I start talking to myself or to you, and I think, is that sure? Is that sure? Is that certain? Perhaps this comes from the fact that a certain type of revolutionary processes has been privileged and, so to speak, singled out. And you know what I mean, that's, I hope not too demagogic, but the idea that comes to my mind, one of the most extraordinary comedies coming from the Greek, once again, of course, from the Greek source, but traveling to the present and informing a certain type of discourse, is Aristophanes' Lysistrata. I mean, this is a perfect revolutionary comedy. So it might show that, in fact, the question is not settled. And then I end with Adam's and Bernard's question, but it can be, I can present it as a continuation of the previous ruminations, because what Marx seems to involve, or what readers, revolutionary intellectuals, poets, writers, André Breton, Bertolt Brecht, or others could draw from the reading of those passages of Marx, is that precisely they ought to enliven and enrich the imaginary of the subalterns, the poor, those from below. Yes. And the latent idea is the dominants do not need an imaginary. That's why they are prosaic. I'm not sure of that at all. And the question that you both raise, in a sense, is a question about the imaginary of the dominant class. The imaginary of the state, the imaginary of the managing directors, CEOs of the big companies in the capitalist world, which leads them, of course, to elaborate counter-revolutionary scenarios of counter-revolutionary measures, preemptive neutralization of uprisings, or simply the capacity to protest and to object. This is the interregnum. I mean, in a sense, it's this circle in which, on the one hand, the revolutionary imaginary seems to be paralyzed by the fact that the tragic dimension has devoured, so to speak, the narrative of revolution, and on the other side, the dominant class, if that means something, or the dominant elite, perhaps that's better, also, in fact, derives its politics from a narrative of the past, and not only from statistic, computers, and scientific rules of governance.
Okay, picking up some suggestions and putting together with Bernard's question. So I think that the opportunity that the Koselleck text gave me is really to mark two different paths of critique of revolution, modern revolution. But of course, those two paths, very different, are focused not so much on Marx. Of course, they don't deal deeply with the text of Marx, but the polemics is against a certain form of Marxism. And so Koselleck gives the opportunity to see how the criticism from the left carve out their argument in this theological criticism. They don't jump immediately to the conclusion that revolution is totalitarian, but they go around until you see the argument. And on the other side, what is missing in the essay of Koselleck is the argument of the critique from the left, also from the radical left. And the critique from the left so sometimes share the same arguments, that of course Marxism and is a teleology, its faith on the necessity of history, of following the laws of history, but the point is more focused on the revolutionary subject. Which kind of subject is the revolutionary subject? And think, of course, of Foucault, but think of Judith Butler today, of many of the leftist critique of revolution. The focus is on the collective subject as an identitarian subject that shut down different voices. And again, I want to point out that this is not argumented through a very precise reading of Marx, but just is focused against Marxism. And I think in this that Arendt is part, maybe at the beginning, of this very broad and differentiated tradition, let's call, that want to recover the spirit of the Soviets, in a way, for what the Soviets represent. Upheavals, starting from below, self-organizing bodies, and this is a sort of hidden tradition, but persistent. And so the paradox is, at the end, if the, let's say, major tradition of revolution, let's call it, using Arendtian term, the modern tradition of revolution, in a way lost its spirit, and it was the main mainstream tradition, the Soviet spirit, just to use the term Soviets for something else, for upheavals, nevertheless continue. And they cannot be shut down. So the reality of this subterranean, hidden current that, of course, cannot but resurface history.
Okay, I think, first of all, Jesús, your very important question, can we think of it in any other but an eschatological or teleological way? Isn't that what you asked?
In a certain way,
In a certain way, or historical way, etc. Yes. I think this is a very important question. And I think what one would want to think about is not in the Trotskyian or Gramscian sense of a permanent revolution, but I mean, remember the word revolution in itself has an idea of revolving, not just but revolution, not just, and uprisings don't. So what we have been saying for some time is, if it really is a matter of wanting, you have to do this with each generation. This is, and also the subalternization by capital, that is to say, taking away from the state structures, citizenship structures, etc. This is not something, and in the old days when one could be a feminist without thinking of the gendered subaltern, it was, we even would say that this is more a women's or a servant's mode of thinking, that you have to do the same things over and over again, rather than, excuse me, I'm talking about ourselves in the remote past, rather than a male way of thinking, where you write a book and you give a footnote and say, well, I wrote it in that book, do look it up. So to an extent, this is, practically speaking, a very important question, that we shall not think that this is just a messianic or secularization of the eschaton, etc., and we will not think permanent revolution just in the Trotskyian or Gramscian way, but we will think of it in a practical way. And that's why the future is so important, because there is an invitation to think the future in Marx. And so, thank you for asking that question. And Etienne, no, I was not contrasting politics and poetry. What I was saying was form and content. That the form, and that's why I went to that Hegelian bit in the Schöne Seele. And in fact, for those of you who will read this unrevised first draft of a blog, I forgot to put in another passage from Hegel, which is from the Law of the Heart. You know, the beginning of the Law of the Heart, where Hegel says that, you know, the law of the individual's law of the heart gets entangled in the real law of the phenomenological law of the heart, which is not only its opposite, but its enemy, and so on. So to an extent, what I was talking about was that this formal way of dealing with the definition of a revolution was being undermined by, and Marx, and I was suggesting that if one forgets the revolution and one looks at capital, the idea of form is extremely, not as a formalist, because that's a bad word for a Marxian, is very important in the contentless commensurability of the value form. But what Marx is talking about here is a content which undermines the idea of the formality of a definition of a revolution, and so that's why. And of course, I agree with you that it is also the question of, in the past, I mean, they took it from the past and they pretended they were the founding fathers. I'm speaking of this country now, and so on. But certainly it's there. Let's not put too much on it. But Adam, your reminder that Schöpfen has two meanings is very powerful, because the idea of being able, I mean, Nietzsche is saying, I write for the philosophers of the future. that the idea of being obliged to imagine a future which one knows will not be what one is imagining. That's the power of the imagination, right? It's neither rational nor irrational. So drawing from the future is just as, and Etienne, I was also, you know, like in a half-jesting way, contrasting the idea of drawing poetic inspiration, that is to say, and I quote you as you were talking, the rhetoric of how important that is. When I, at the end, said that we don't want to make a contrast between rhetoric and logic, that's where the form and content thing, far be it from me to say that poetry and politics should be a binary opposition. No. So that's, I was not saying Marx is not talking strategy and so on. So there, that's where that is. As for Bernard's question, this is a very important question, Bernard, and that's why I called it a double bind. You see, when you engage in a political situation, you are thinking of a collectivity which has an identity. It does not have to have a race identity, which is the problem now with the talk of identity. That's the problem that I was talking about. Identitarianism is not class identity. I'm sorry. Today, identitarianism is not class identity. You don't really see that. But those identities that in the name of which one rises up, they are dictated by the other side, because the other side oppresses you in terms of that identity. So that to think of that as anything but a methodological necessity for struggle is, especially if you win. I mean, I'm written in a great victory, the Indian independence. You know, I was born in colonial India. Great victory. I mean, this is the 70th anniversary. But how did it go wrong right from the start? Look what happened. Because to an extent, that Orientalist idea of India, that we took that a certain class as an identity. It was a grave mistake. So that to an extent, the fact that one is obliged to define an identity in the name of which there is a revolution is not truth, as it were, if you know what I mean. And as for me describing myself in that way, I could have described myself, of course, in also other ways. I made it as dependent upon my admiration for Balibar as possible, because I felt that in a certain sense, Balibar writing on Marx and Hegel was writing in a felicitous mode. And so therefore, keeping my respect, I mean, look, as we are talking, you know, the question, how can we think revolution without going back to Greece and Rome? The answer is no, we cannot. But then where does it leave us? Are we obliged to think that revolution, which is something that belongs, and it's only an English word here, and I was talking about Umwälzung and so on, and upheaval, which is cognate with Aufhebung and so on and so forth. That's completely cognate. But those are European languages. They're the world's wealth of languages. I mean, I quoted Ambedkar in his essay, Buddhism or Marxism, where he's talking about learning without sila, Pali word, and the extraordinary importance of Buddha's choice of Pali, which is a Creole. As a prince, he could have chosen the refined language, Sanskrit, but he didn't. So this idea, sila, is mistranslated as character. So what is Ambedkar supposedly saying about Buddha? That learning without character is dangerous. How boring. So to an extent, the idea of identity being there in terms of a revolutionary enterprise, remember that the limits of our ignorance keeps us unable to imagine it except in terms of European antiquity. The idea of revolution can be let loose from the obligation to find its roots. What are roots? What is a history of literature? Some of us have defined the study of history and literature as the study of creolity, rather than, I mean, there one takes Dante, one takes Proust saying what is French but false Latin. People who have the courage to say these kinds of things are the ones who are absolutely in their language. If I had the time, I would talk about how I teach those children of the landless, illiterate, untouchables, how I teach them to love English, comparing it to our alphabet. You know, but it would take time. So therefore, the idea, we have to remember that I don't know the languages of the world, but in Arabic and Chinese, the word for belonging to a nation state is not related to a polis. It's not called a citizen, neither in Arabic nor in Chinese. So you ask yourselves, why is that? So to an extent, the idea of the obligation to go back to European antiquity is very nice. But on the other hand, what I was saying, we must not take our disciplinary world as the world. This is what I was talking to Dennett about. Dennett's problem was that postmodernism is evil and analytic philosophy is cool. And that's one of the problems with Judith, by the way. The analytic philosophers are not obliged to think about the subject position of the philosopher. You can just move. You can touch everybody in the world. It's a little bit like Glendower. I can call the spirits from the vasty deep. What is the answer? Why? So can I. And so can anyone. But when you do call, do they answer you? That's the question. That's the problem. So therefore, I would say that revolutionary practice and identitarianism is unfortunately not unconnected, but it is a problem rather than a solution. And most often it is taken as a solution, and a solution that shuts out the others. That shuts out the others. Whereas at a university, for sure, what we need to develop is a flexible imagination, which can draw from the future, knowing that the future will have been something else, the future anterior. So thank you very much for these really wonderful questions.
Thank you. We have 4 more questions, 5 actually. Kendall first, please.
I can speak very loudly, actually. I was very intrigued by a couple of moments in the blogs. Gayatri, in your blog, you say something that you repeated emphatically this evening in your spoken remarks about national liberation. You said national liberation is not a revolution. And I want to try to suture that together with a line in Etienne's blog in which he refers to an insistent counter-revolutionary discourse today that refers to the return of revolutionary illusions as a mortal threat for the society, the economy, the democratic institutions, etc., against which a preventive ideological war should be waged. So the question I want to ask has to do not so much with the relationship between national liberation and revolution, but with the relationship between national liberation and counter-revolution. And it is suggested to me in part by 2 historical examples, one of which is Hannah Arendt's text, because On Revolution, at least that part of On Revolution which celebrates the revolution that she most admires, namely the American Revolution, is a story, in fact, about a counter-revolution, right? So what Arendt celebrates in a book whose ostensible subject, or at least title, is Revolution, is a counter-revolution. The American Constitutio Libertatis, a bloodless coup d'etat, which installed a constitution and a legalist conception of change, of counter-change, in fact, The Constitution was very much about a counter-revolution. So what is the relationship between national liberation and counter-revolution? The second historical example, which comes to mind to me because today is the 57th anniversary of it, is the bloodless coup d'etat led by one Joseph Désiré Mobutu in the Congo, which led to the death a few months later of Patrice Lumumba, another national liberation movement that ended in counter-revolution. So how should we think, particularly at this moment, about the relationship between the national liberation project on one side and counter-revolution? Is there something like a constitutive relationship so that even though national liberation is not revolution, it is in some meaningful sense always haunted by counter-revolution, which is the afterlife, as Etienne was implicitly suggesting, the afterlife of revolution.
Thank you. Rosalind?
I'm gonna follow along that theme, but from a rather different perspective. I mean, I addressed this question to the whole panel and to the group in anticipation of future discussions. I mean, it seems to me that it was extremely helpful to distinguish here between failed revolution and counter-revolution. And I take it, Etienne, that you are arguing that the failed revolution and counter-revolution. And I take it that you read the 18th Brumaire as an unfolding of the analysis of failed revolution in order to show that counter-revolution is always already prior. And that when one gets to the end of the essay, and the account of the peasant proprietors separated from each other by virtue of forms of land ownership, the fantasy of self-sufficiency that goes with that, that the argument is that the social organization is itself counter-revolutionary. It is already anticipatorily and structurally, constitutively blocking or mitigating against revolution. Blocking, that is, the production of social solidarity across difference, because the mere relation between those peasant proprietors is proximity, it's not identity. And yet it's in that moment that Marx turns to and accuses, whether it's an apposition or a summary analysis or a placeholder, accuses them of superstition. So not merely the structural conditions of the distribution of land, the blockage of solidarity across difference, but superstition. And I would ask you to, or I propose for all of us to think that the superstition of the peasant proprietor is the form of appearance of identitarianism in that moment. And I do think that the question of identity is there in the beginning, in the way that it's formed. So, I mean, it's for that reason, on those grounds, that those small peasant proprietors can identify with the ridiculous and singular figure of the farcical emperor in that way. So, I mean, the question that arises for me, I think, in that context is, what is the work of the negative if counter-revolution is prior to failed revolution in that way? And I'm not asking this in a kind of formalist way. I mean, I wonder, actually, if our turn to the term uprising instead of revolution is of a piece with this. That is to say, it's the expression of a kind of thought that imagines itself to be post-dialectical and therefore is reduced to a concept of negativity, which means essentially destruction or opposition, and that is the form of appearance of identitarianism in our own radical discourse, yeah? I mean, as Gayatri has said, those identity categories are the ones that were used for the administration of the constitutive organization of society in a manner that prohibited solidarity, or at least made it difficult. So my question for all of us has to do with the turn from revolution to uprising vis-a-vis the problem of the negative. but I would suggest that superstition in the 18th Brumaire is the name of the form of identitarianism in that moment.
Thank you, Rosalind. Karuna? Oh, sorry. I'll give you mine.
I'll be very quick. It's actually, I think, follows up on the last comment. And it was really just an invitation, I think, for the panelists, but maybe the seminar as a whole to, well, maybe it seemed like there was a beginning thought that Etienne and Bernard expressed about the exhaustion of the idea of revolution. And I guess I wanted to ask if the speakers, if everyone shared that sense, and in what sense do we narrate or recall what that exhaustion is? Is it the exhaustion of the idea or a particular concept of modern revolution that we've read in Koselleck? Or is it also a sense of not just the exhaustion of an idea, but also of the practical experience of futility that modern revolution has ended in reversals of various kinds? And it seems that, again, before we turn, or as we turn to other forms, uprising, etc., that we might need to give an account to ourselves about what that futility is, or what we ourselves take that to be. And so obviously some it's ending in terror. Some of it also could be an old Weberian critique that total revolution is impossible in some sense because of bureaucratic structure of modern society, of modern capitalism, something, the kind of desire for a radical transformation or a return to immediacy of some kind is impossible given bureaucracy or etc. And I think the third one I would just raise as one to think about, not necessarily that I have an answer to, but whether, and Koselleck mentions it, is the older association between, not necessarily modern revolution and civil war. And in some sense, how indebted we are, we think the concept of revolution is to armed rebellion or arms. And it seems to me that there is, in the backdrop of the turn to thinking about other revolt, especially the ones that we've chosen, another class might have put civil war, armed rebellion. All of this is linked to the history of warfare of some kind. And so Etienne also brought this up, that one of the questions, I think, is whether there is also the fact that we're living in a moment in which armed rebellion, according to some theorists, is at its least, it's been, very few armed rebellions have been successful in the last 100 years. So we're living in a technological moment in which states have an extreme monopoly over the instruments of violence, and there may be a technical story about arming that matters to whether we strategically, morally, ethically as well move away from revolutions. So it's just a sense of opening up a continuing discussion of what we take to be the practical or exhaustion of an idea or the futility of an idea, and the difference between them.
Thank you, Veronica. Could you pass the microphone to Thomas, please?
Thank you. Mine is very much in line with the previous two comments. And it was sparked by the idea that Bernard was saying at the beginning, that historians have sort of sacralized revolution, and it seems to me as if in 2 hours we've completely desacralized revolution. And whether it's because it's excessively formal, or it leads necessarily to a form of totalitarianism, or because it's always already preempted by counter-revolution, I'm sort of wondering if that's not something that Marx himself was realizing in the 18th Brumaire, when he, precisely by prefacing the book with the notion of repetition, which is something that Koselleck seems to sort of forget in a certain sense, when he says that the modern notion of revolution has lost the revolving character and is now much more premised on a linear sense of temporality. And Marx, it's not coincidental, I think, that he starts with the notion of repetition and ends the book with the idea that revolution only actually recapitulates a new form of centralization of the state. So maybe what we need to also be thinking is how something that would not be revolution, uprising, whatever we want to call it, would actually escape from this dialectic, because it seems to me as if, for Marx here, revolution is actually a part of capital itself. It's not an antithesis to capital.
Professor Spivak, I just have a very short question in light of what you've just spoken about, especially around the question of identity. So earlier on you touched on the concept of intersectionality within revolutions.
Intersectionality?
Intersectionality, yes. Which seems to me like it would entail moving away from a single axis understanding of that against which we are rising up. But you've also previously spoken about strategic essentialism. Presumably around a specific marker. So my question to you is just then about how these concepts of intersectionality and essentialism interact, and whether the former doesn't necessarily result in the disposal of, whether the latter doesn't result in us disposing of the former. Can they exist together?
Thank you.
Just repeat that last sentence, okay? Please. Repeat that.
Oh, you've spoken about intersectionality, but you've also spoken about essentialism. I just want to know if those two can exist in tandem, whether they're not mutually exclusive.
Thank you very much. So, because we are short in time, why don't we do this? Is each of our guests takes 3-4 minutes, address a little bit the questions. Most, perhaps, of these comments will be part of our discussion, our ongoing discussion, but maybe you can take, 3 or 4 minutes, address a couple of questions in this analphabetical order. So, contrary to the order, starting with Gayatri.
Yes, Rosalind, were you referring? Okay, were you referring to that?
Use the mic.
Yes, historical.
Even if you are.
Yes, we did. Yes, historical. Use the mic. Historical. You know, the mic. Holding the mic is kind of such a phallic thing, but it's really true. I mean, anyway, were you talking about the belief that someone called Napoleon was going to bring in a new miracle? That's what you were talking about, the superstition?
No. I mean the kind of rootlessness of the category of superstition, which is attributed to the peasants, seems to me to indicate that not just that belief in the messianic figure, but the fantasy of self-sufficiency.
Oh, the fantasy of self-sufficiency. Okay, now, what was 3 or 4 minutes, so I can't really touch on it since I didn't understand it well. So let me answer your question, which is directed to me. Well, it seems to me that the need for intersectionality, which is very, very important, and I'm glad that it's come in, because it's not identitarian. But what happens quite often is that there is, it's like relativism. There is actually an absolute position from which people are relativist. So to an extent, what we have, that's why I was talking about the Nigerian woman who spoke about her experience of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a good idea, but it is in fact, what one has to see is who orders intersectionality, who celebrates intersectionality, how is intersectionality actually working out, and therefore I find this to be somewhat suspect, number one. Number two, about essentialism, I think strategic use of essentialism I actually gave up in '93. It's in the outside in the teaching machine lead article, but that's as it may be. People like it, but it seems to me that of course we are always essentialist when we identify. Who cannot be essentialist? It's not possible. But the idea is, how do we feel about having to be essentialistic? It's not possible to be fully anti-essentialist. I mean, you would be, what would you be? Vogelfrei. But at any rate, so therefore, I would say that it can exist together. Intersectionality can be, in fact, most often is, a collection of essences, you know what I mean, rather than like being anti-essentialist, etc. There's much more to be said about this very, very important question. It's a practical question, but 3 or 4 minutes will give me only this. I wanted to talk about many other things, but I think now is not the moment.
Thank you very much, Gayatri.
Yes, I'm always in the middle, even if we change the order. But so maybe at this point I should raise questions, because I really don't know what does it mean today, revolution. And I really would address this question to my co-panelists. And so what can I say? Revolution where? Revolution aiming at what? I don't know. But what I wanted to emphasize is the, let's say, ever-present possibility of uprising as breaking for the appearance of freedom, and these intervals not run by a unitary will, are demands for a different future and for a sort of changing the distribution of power and changing the injustice. And so, I don't know, and I just would like to quote a provocative sentence question from Foucault. Is revolution really desirable? Stop.
Thank you so much. Okay, it becomes now really tight and complicated. I don't know either what revolution means, but contrary, or what it, yes, it has. But contrary to Foucault and you, perhaps, I don't know, I am not able, in spite of all my tentatives, my essays, to get rid of the name. You know, that's, so the content or the meaning is missing, but the name is insisting, and that's why we are here, it seems to me. Thomas, I take it that what you suggested negatively, among other things, was that in the end, surprisingly maybe, Koselleck happens to be more linear in his understanding of historical time than Marx himself. And I would completely agree with that, if that is your, in that text at least. Then, I don't follow exactly the same order. Rosalind, I thank you enormously for constructing this, antithesis, which you said I had proposed, but or read in Marx's text, between the issue of failed revolutions and counter-revolution, and for 2 reasons. First, I have to be very quick, because the respective values, semantic values, but also ideological or political values of using the category uprising and or the category revolution are now in the middle of our debate. And there seems to me, including particularly in some of the things you said or what you quoted from Arendt and others, and Foucault would go in the same direction, that there is a kind of a suggestion, idea that is haunting the contemporary debates. I don't know if it's true, but it's very provocative, which is something like revolutions can fail, and perhaps even they must fail, but uprisings cannot. Uprisings can be crushed, but they cannot fail, because in a sense they represent the pure moment of the negative or saying no to the existing order. I don't say if it's true or false, if it's a good idea or not, but that's one of the reasons. And the other, a little bit more sophisticated philosophically, if you like, is it seems to me that I can now derive from your distinction the following issue. There are philosophers, among the most remarkable, of course, in the Western tradition of political philosophy, that have insisted, drawing on Machiavelli, etc., and others, Spinoza, for example, that ultimately a state can be destroyed only from the inside, decomposed, because of its internal contradictions. Therefore, the confrontation with an external enemy that is more powerful can take place, but it's not the decisive factor. Why not to apply that idea, at least as a question, to the cases of revolution on which we are reflecting historically, and ask the question, if it were not the case, you see how convoluted that is, if it were not the case that revolutions, when they fail, that is because of their internal weaknesses or contradictions or disorders, and not because they are confronting an enemy that is more powerful. Again, on this point, I'm sure of nothing, but it strikes me as a perhaps meaningful question. And then, very quickly, but I cannot not say something on that, Karuna and Kendall. War. Is there a session planned on the question of war? At the beginning of Arendt's book, she says, let's put aside the question of war. That's already bracketing a huge fundamental aspect of the issue. At the end of Koselleck's text, the question of war powerfully returns into the debate about a revolution. All that, in a sense, today, for people of my age, especially somebody who wrote a book on the dictatorship of proletariat, takes us to the question of what we think, how we understand the fact. I said that Marx had anticipated the 48 revolution, but Lenin also anticipated something and produced an incredible performative statement that happened to be true, but that in the end perhaps produced the catastrophe. Namely, let's transform the imperialist war into a revolutionary civil war. And that keeps haunting, in fact, a lot of the revolutionary imaginary, even in pacifist forms, not necessarily leading to civil wars. But then the question becomes, what type of war are we having now? And is there any possibility of transforming that type of war into a revolutionary process or produce a reversal? That's Karuna's question, or one aspect of Karuna's question. And of course, I have no answer, but I think it's absolutely crucial. And it has to take us to discussions about what function, not only war, but arms trade, distribution of weaponry from the single guy who stands his ground in Mississippi to the construction of nuclear armament plays in today's capitalism. And finally, excuse me, I know I'm abusing, because Kendall, I totally agree with you. The idea that Gayatri quoted, that national liberation movements are counter-revolutionary, is a Marxist ideological prejudice that comes from the fact that, in Wallerstein's terminology, if you like, one of the so-called anti-systemic movements, the class movement, has to be privileged at the expense of the other, and therefore, of course, the other has to appear as counter-revolutionary. But the dilemma within the very concept of revolution is there since the beginning of modernity. So it's there in the American Revolution, it's there in the French Revolution as a seizing of sovereignty by and for the nation. It's there in 48, and it's there in the liberation movements of the 20th century. I once had a public debate with Slavoj Žižek, once again, here in New York at Cooper Union, when they set up the big debate on the idea of communism. And Slavoj said, we were discussing China with the issue of how we interpret the trajectory of the Chinese Revolution between 1930 or 1949 and today. And Slavoj essentially said, well, the transformation of China into the most powerful national sovereign capitalist power in today's world is a canning of history that ultimately will lead to a more effective communist transformation. This is the same reasoning as in Marx's 18th Brumaire. And I said to him, Slavoj, how about the exactly opposite interpretation? The fact that the Chinese Revolution presented itself and lived itself and organized itself as a communist revolution, isn't that a canning of history that eventually leads to the triumph of nationalism in today's world? Now, that's in a sense an embarrassing a question to ask, but I totally agree with you that it cannot be settled in advance through the use of the old terminology.
Just one small thing. National liberation is not counter-revolutionary. I was not talking out of that Marxist prejudice. I said it was not a revolution. And we, as national liberation successors, etc., we have a project about how it could, in fact, go in another direction. I just had a very long discussion about it on the eve of the 70th anniversary. And I would say, I forgot your question, Kendall, because it's so late. I would say just one thing. That's the whole national question there. Katanga was not Congo. You know, that's the whole thing that was forgotten because, you know, Flora Shaw and Nigeria, for example, all of that stuff. It's very long. Answer I cannot give. But it really is not. Lumumba wanted to imagine a nation, but it can't be imagined so easily. So that's where I would begin to move.
All right, so let me try and conclude, pull together all of these threads into one final comment, and then we'll close. And picking up perhaps on Kendall Thomas's memory of Patrice Lumumba today. And thinking about it not as his death being something about a counter-revolution, but rather possibly as a question of reproduction of power, a reproduction of power going on after that. To pick that also with Professor Spivak's notion of a generational dimension, to Karuna's idea of exhaustion, to Rosalind's question, to Thomas's question about the revolution. I think as I was listening to this, and of course to Etienne's discussion particularly of war and the way in which right now, we're selling military equipment to police forces in the ways in which war is returning as a mode of a reproduction of power, that actually maybe what killed the revolution was not the historians, but May 68 and the debates over and the shifting conceptions of power as a result of May 68. The shifting conception of power as being so capillary, right? And the resistance to the idea of seizing state institutions. It might actually have been May 68. It might actually have been in this room. Let's stop there. It's been incredibly fruitful, incredibly productive. Thank you so much, Etienne, Simona, Gayatri, Jesús.